In the middle of the Caribbean Sea, a family was vacationing on their yacht. Julia, the mother, went into the water to swim. While taking a break, she suddenly felt something strange. Seeing nothing around, she thought maybe it was just her imagination. A few seconds later, she felt that strange sensation again. Again, seeing nothing, this time she became scared and started swimming back toward the yacht. Just then, someone grabbed her leg, and she began shouting for help. Her daughter, Casey, was wearing headphones and listening to music, so she didn't notice anything. Her husband, Tom, and son, Ben, were busy fishing. Julia tried to stay afloat, but water entering her mouth made it hard to scream. After a while, Tom realized he hadn't seen Julia for a long time. He looked around the yacht and finally saw his wife in trouble. He immediately called the kids, turned the yacht in her direction, and jumped into the water. He quickly reached Julia, grabbed her, and swam toward the yacht. The children pulled both of them onto the boat. The family took care of Julia, but she told herself that maybe it had just been the waves. That night, they all celebrated Ben's birthday. At that time, Casey received a call from her boyfriend, so she went outside with her laptop. During the video call, her boyfriend told her that big, dark clouds were gathering over the city. Suddenly, the call glitched and froze. Casey ran to tell her family, but Tom said, "We're probably far from land, so the signal is weak." Just then, they all heard a strange sound. When they went outside, they saw a group of whales passing by. Tom said, "Whales always follow the direction of the Earth's magnetic field." But when the storm hit, the whales became disoriented. Suddenly, the yacht rocked violently, and Ben fell overboard. Worry filled Tom's mind. He wondered if the yacht had suffered any damage. So he put on a diving suit and went down to inspect. After a while, he resurfaced, but his shoulder had a deep injury. Julia immediately stitched up the wound. Tom said, "Underwater, it felt like something enormous was behind me. But the moment I turned around, I hit the propeller." He added, "Whatever it was huge." Tom noticed that several parts of the yacht were damaged, so they decided to call for help. Julia tried repeatedly to communicate over the radio, and Casey searched for a signal on her mobile phone, but nothing worked. Just then, Casey saw something strange and screamed, but it was actually Ben. He was just playing around with a mask on. A short time later, the yacht completely stopped and was stranded in the middle of the sea. Julia heard a sound on the radio, but it was so weak and distorted that nothing could be understood. Tom informed the family that they only had 4 days' worth of food and water, so they would have to rely on hope for a fishing boat to rescue them. Suddenly, the radar detected something, and immediately they heard a strange noise. Everyone ran outside and was shocked to see meteoroids were falling from the sky, one after another. Wherever a meteoroid hit, there were massive explosions. One meteoroid landed right near them in the water, so Tom quickly tried to steer the yacht. The engine started with difficulty, but immediately another meteoroid struck the nearby sea surface. Terrified, the family clung tightly to each other. Then Tom realized the fiery projectiles falling were not meteoroids at all. They were satellites. Meanwhile, Ben noticed smoke coming from the yacht. Tom went down to check and saw that the engine was completely destroyed. The wind grew stronger, so the family took shelter inside the yacht. But they didn't notice that the compass was spinning wildly. The yacht began to shake violently. Ben fell again. This time, he was injured. The waves slammed violently against the yacht. Tom struggled outside and brought life jackets for everyone. Just then, the power went out. Tom quickly pressed the button on the power box, and the lights came back on. At that moment, he noticed Julia's nose was bleeding. Julia felt dizzy, and Casey went to the stairs and vomited. Tom tried to use the radio to call for help, but there was no signal. Suddenly, a sharp, high-frequency sound rang out, and the wind grew even more destructive. Julia tried to close the doors, but one door remained open. Through that gap, the stormy wind shattered the windows. Tom lit a flare, but after a short while, darkness enveloped everything again. The next morning, the family woke up in shock. They had survived the storm, but half of the yacht was destroyed. When they went outside, they saw in disbelief the sea had completely vanished. The yacht was now stranded on dry land. Everyone was stunned. Casey searched for a signal on her phone, but the network was completely down. Ben began playing with dead crabs. Tom checked the compass. It had flipped. The last time this happened was 7 million years ago. Casey feared that her boyfriend might be dead. She broke down. When Julia tried to comfort her, Casey pushed her away and sat alone. Julia and Tom checked the remaining equipment on the yacht. Ben tied a rock to one of his birthday balloons and released it into the sky. hoping, perhaps, that some living person might see it. Then Tom tried the radio again, and this time they got a signal. A voice came through from the other side. He introduced himself as Nav and said he was the captain of a submarine. His submarine was also stranded on land. Nav confirmed that the Earth's magnetic poles had reversed. This was why the sea had receded and the land had flooded. He explained that, so far, he hadn't seen any other living people, and all communication systems were completely down. Nav further explained that the Earth's poles would reverse again, and the sea would likely return within a week. He warned the family, "Move to higher ground as quickly as possible, because when the water comes back, it will arrive with devastating force." He also mentioned that his colleague had died in the accident and that the submarine only had space for 3 people. Tom and Julia pleaded, "Please save our children." Nav gave them his coordinates. Tom calculated that it would take 2 or 3 days to reach him. He told the family, "Let's rest tonight and set off first thing tomorrow morning." The next morning, while the family was packing their belongings, Tom suddenly noticed movement in the distance. As they approached, they saw a disheveled man with a dog. The man held a device in his hand, and the dog kept barking constantly. Tom cautiously approached and offered the man a bottle of water. But the man spoke in an unknown language, which Tom could not understand. After a brief period of calm, the situation suddenly turned, the man became aggressive, and Tom was injured. Terrified, Julia ran and hid inside the yacht. She closed the door, while Casey and Ben hid under the sofa. Julia told them to stay quiet and took a knife, taking refuge in the bathroom. Outside, the stranger tried to break into the yacht, pushing and forcing his way in. Once inside, he began searching around, but Julia, using her wits, managed to slip out through a small opening. The man assumed Julia had escaped. Julia was about to move silently when the dog noticed her and began barking loudly. Frightened, Julia tried to defend herself, and in the chaos, the dog was injured. Hearing the dog's cries, the man rushed over. Seeing his companion in that state, he became furious. Julia tried entering the yacht again from the other side. She climbed toward a broken window, but the man reached there first. A struggle ensued. Julia fought desperately to survive. Despite being injured, she managed to regain control of herself. At that moment, Casey bravely came outside and fired a flare gun. The blaze lit up the entire yacht, forcing the man to retreat. As the fire spread rapidly, Ben and Casey hurriedly escaped from the yacht. Julia went back inside to grab maps and equipment, then reunited with her children and fled. The 3 of them stopped at a distance from the yacht. Ben, crying, thought of his father, and Julia and Casey hugged him tightly. Together, the 3 silently bid their final farewell to Tom. Suddenly, they saw the stranger emerging from the yacht again. They realized the danger was far from over. Moments later, the yacht was completely destroyed in an explosion. The family quickly walked and eventually reached a small waterfall, taking a brief rest. Casey said, "Maybe the man saw our balloon." Hearing this, Ben began blaming himself, but Julia placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "No, this is not your fault. Now we just have to keep moving forward, because the danger is not over yet." As they continued walking, they came to a small pond. Ben was suddenly shocked to see a dead hammerhead shark lying there. At that moment, Julia noticed. The mysterious man was once again approaching them from a distance. They ran as fast as they could, but while fleeing, they slipped down a sand dune. At the bottom, they saw that the area was littered with toxic waste and rusty metal debris. The family carefully crossed the area, thinking that perhaps this time they had finally escaped the man. As they continued, they saw enormous dead sea creatures and piles of plastic accumulated under the sea. The environment felt like a strange, silent death. Ben began walking slowly. Julia realized he was nearly out of water. She told everyone to stop, but when she checked the water bottles, her face went pale. Most of the water was gone. Casey said softly, "Maybe I didn't close the bottle properly." Julia, angry, snapped, "Because of your carelessness, even our last hope is gone." Casey replied, "What difference does it make? Will we even survive?" A heated argument erupted between mother and daughter, but eventually, exhausted, the family continued walking in silence. After a while, they saw a wrecked airplane. Strange sounds came from inside. Everyone held their breath, but when they looked closer, they saw it was just some birds. They decided to spend the night inside the wrecked airplane. Sharing the little food they had, Julia found an old family photo in Tom's jacket. Seeing it, her eyes welled up with tears. Casey quietly asked, "Mom, what was your love story with Dad like?" Julia smiled softly and said, "Your father was my patient at the hospital. One day, he brought flowers and a poem and said, 'I want to begin life with you.' Late at night, Casey stepped outside for a moment. Suddenly, she sensed someone behind her. At that very moment, Julia appeared from behind and saved her, defeating the intruder in a desperate struggle. Shivering, Casey hugged her mother and whispered, "It's okay, Mom. Everything will be all right." At dawn, they saw insects crawling around the lifeless body of the man. The family noticed strange bite marks on his body, meaning some dangerous creatures were lurking nearby. As they prepared to leave, movement started under the sand. A few hours later, Julia and Casey were checking the map and verifying directions when Ben silently moved ahead. Julia screamed, "Ben, stop!" But Ben had already bent down by a small pond and begun drinking the water. Julia quickly pulled him back and said, "This unknown water could make you sick." The sun grew stronger, so the family tied cloths over their heads to shield themselves. Ben weakened, and his vision began to blur. As they walked, they came across some old wooden chairs. Julia and Casey used them to make a temporary shelter. Julia gave Ben some medicine and decided that they would spend the night there. At dawn, Julia's sleep was broken by a strange sound. Looking outside, she saw a huge swarm of crabs moving toward them. She immediately woke Casey and Ben, and the three of them began running for their lives. While running, they reached an abandoned cargo ship. Inside, 3 people were still alive. One woman wanted to help, but the other 2 refused and closed the door. The crabs quickly reached the ship. Julia placed the children on top of a container and tried to climb up herself. At that moment, a crab bit her foot, but Casey and Ben pulled her up together. Some crabs slipped inside through gaps in the container, spreading panic. The people inside tried to defend themselves with weapons, but gradually the situation spiraled out of control. Julia bandaged her wound and fainted. When she regained consciousness a while later, dust storms covered everything around her. She realized she was alone. Panicked, she ran around looking for Casey and Ben. She picked up a metal rod lying next to a dead woman and loudly called out their names. Finally, Casey heard her voice and returned. She said, "I went looking for help with Ben, but there was no one." Soon, they reunited with Ben, who had found an open container. They decided to take shelter there until the storm passed. Julia took out Tom's old lighter and disinfected her wound. Tears filled her eyes from the pain, but she stayed composed. She had to survive for her children. After the storm subsided, they found another container. Inside were many bottled water, some dry food, a radio, and a weapon. Hope returned to them. They realized that survival was still possible. Julia tried to contact Nav again and told him that they had lost their map. Through the radio, Nav said, "Arthropod-type creatures attacked us. They are now the new inhabitants of the sea, completely maddened by oxygen." He warned, "You need to move very quickly. My device indicates the sea will return sooner than expected. You only have a few hours." Then Nav fired a flare into the sky. The family began walking toward the light. After a long journey, they reached a broken toilet, where Ben stopped to rest for a moment. Finally, they spotted the submarine from a distance. But to reach it, they had to cross a massive rocky path. Suddenly, the surrounding walls trembled. Heavy rocks began to fall, and a terrifying landslide occurred. Julia immediately pushed her children to one side and moved back herself to avoid being crushed. Moments later, a massive stone wall rose between them. Julia shouted, "You go ahead, I'll come later." But Casey, crying, said, "No, Mom." You try to get up. A heated argument and tears ensued between the two. Finally, Julia promised, "I will find you, I swear." Reluctantly, Casey took her brother's hand and ran toward the mountain path. They finally reached the submarine, but when they arrived, they saw Nav lying outside, soaked in blood. Casey's eyes filled with tears. She thought, "Now we have to operate the submarine ourselves." Then suddenly, it hit her, her mother. At that moment, Julia saw a swarm of giant crabs approaching from a distance. She raised her gun and fired. Several crabs fell, but the swarm was so large that it was nearly impossible to control. Just then, Casey appeared atop the mountain. She waved her hand and shouted, "Mom, hurry up!" Despite her injured leg, Julia struggled to climb up. Casey pulled her along, and together, breathless, they ran toward the submarine. Ben took position above and began firing, trying to distract the crabs long enough for the family to reach safety. The crabs reached Nav's lifeless body and immediately began tearing it apart. Julia picked up her gun and fired continuously until the children were safely inside the submarine. Once inside, she realized the bullets were all gone. In rage, she threw the empty gun at the crabs and rushed inside herself. The family quickly closed and locked the hatch. Through the window, they saw hundreds of crabs circling the submarine, scratching at its surface. At that very moment, the sea returned with a deafening roar. The three of them quickly fastened their seatbelts and held each other's hands tightly. The submarine shook violently from the impact of the waves. Memories of their entire journey flashed before Julia's eyes, and Casey vomited. Then, that sharp, high-pitched sound was heard again. Slowly, all three of them lost consciousness. After a while, Julia and her children opened their eyes. They could breathe, and the sheer relief of being alive made them laugh. They opened the submarine hatch and stepped outside. Before them lay a devastated city. Walls encrusted with sea salt, broken bridges, and a faint light in the sky. Yet life remained. They looked at one another in a new world, with the hope of a fresh start.